Uh, so, we're starting a new series tonight. It's called The You Effect. But more importantly, it goes basically off the series that we just finished about how what we believe on our inside affects our outside. And what we're moving into with this series is how what you believe on the inside affecting your outside, how that can actually impact other people. So what we're going to talk about tonight is about how you have more effect than you may think that you actually do. But to start, I want you to answer this question. I want you to think about somebody that is you would consider like your most fun friend or your most exciting friend. I guess it would be Link because he's pretty fun to be around in my situation right now. But think about that person that's in your friend group that completely changes the mood of the entire friend group. They're so fun that everybody wants them to be there, and some people, this is the person that you ask if they're going to be there before you decide to go. Or maybe they're really nice, and so they make you want to be nicer. Maybe they work really hard, on the team, whether that's baseball, football, choir, whatever. Maybe they work so hard that it makes everybody else on the team want to just work that much harder. They're an impact person. They're an influencer in that regard. Or maybe think of somebody that's the opposite. Maybe think of somebody who's so mean to everyone that everybody just kind of feels on edge around them. Or think about somebody who's always mad about something, so you never really know how they're going to affect the mood of the situation, right? Or maybe you can think of somebody that's so loud when they speak that other people literally have to yell over them to be able to be heard. And whether it's a good person or a bad person, either one of these extremes, these people who have significant impact on a situation, these people who have a significant impact on a situation, right? They typically don't really think about it when they do it. And here's what I mean. And this is also why the series is so important for us to realize how much of an impact we do have. Because when we're talking about influence, when we're talking about how we affect other people, for some of you, it's obvious. Maybe you hold a position on your school, like student government, or maybe you're a team captain, or maybe you're a lead. Maybe you're the person that people look up to. And then for some of you that are going to hear this, maybe you're that person that either doesn't feel like you have much of an influence and or doesn't really want to have an influence. You kind of want to just go with the flow and feel like you don't really have much to offer to the situation. But either way, whether we know that we have influence or we don't really want to have influence, I think in both situations we kind of downplay how much impact we actually have and how much ability to affect the things around us we really have and what could happen because of it. But today we're going to look at somebody, and it's probably going to shock you a little bit if you listen along at who it is that we're going to talk about in the Bible that had effect on others even if they didn't have much. So if you want to flip there right now, if you're listening along, go to John, and we're going to be in chapter 6, and we're going to start right at the beginning. And John's one of the 4 books of the Gospels. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what's up, Taylor? You're here right in time. We're going to be in John chapter 6. But basically, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are accounts of people who either walked with Jesus or knew people who walked with Jesus. And it tells about his life and how he lived his life and how he followed his life. And the story that we're looking at today is in the book of John, and it's written by John, of course. And John was one of the closest, not only followers of Jesus and not only friends of Jesus, but he was also a student of Jesus, meaning he listened very closely to what he said and how he went about his life and how he lived his life. So what John says is credible because he knew Jesus firsthand. And what we're going to look at today is one not so uncommon account, but Jesus is followed by a huge crowd. And most places Jesus was followed by a huge crowd, and those people were there either mainly for one of two reasons: either listen to what he had to say or do, or to try to catch him in a lie and to see where he was wrong. And So this story starts out no different than most of the situations. So in John chapter 6, we're going to read verses 1 through 6. And Scripture says this: Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, which was one of his 12 disciples, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So imagine this. There's this humongous crowd of people, and they're coming here to see this awesome miracle worker who does these crazy cool things, right, all the time. He just is doing crazy stuff, healing people, raising people from the dead, all this, just crazy stuff, right, that blows people's minds. And then all of a sudden, this guy who's supposed to be performing the miracles looks at one of his followers and says, "Hey, what should we do?" And I'm sure if Philip was anything like me or like a normal person, he's probably like, "What do you mean? What are we supposed to do? You're the kind of the important guy here. You probably got this handled, right? You probably don't need my input." But instead, what Philip says, he says, Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." And what Philip's basically saying is, if we're going to feed these people, we're going to need so much money. Like, could you imagine how much money it would cost to buy like 5,000, like number ones from Chick-fil-A? That'd be so much food, right? Like, so much money. He's basically saying we would have to have so much to be able to do what you're asking me about. And then the story continues, and we'll read 8 and 9. Scripture says, another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" So apparently there's, one kid in the whole town that has a good mom that packed him a lunch. And it was something. I mean, I say that jokingly, but seriously, Andrew looks at this kid and he's like, "Well, this is something. I mean, it's not 5,000, Chick-fil-A number ones, but it's food." And then this is where Jesus went to work. In 10 through 14, we read, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." So if you read that and you're just reading that could lead you to so many questions. Some not so serious, like, I mean, did they just like buffet style, like come get what you wanted? Or like, where did these 12 baskets come from out of nowhere? Were they just carrying baskets? Is that just something that they did at the time? Or like, how? Like, that's a pretty understandable question. Like, how did that work? How did so many people get fed off of this little bit amount of food, this little boy's lunch? But here's a bigger question. And here's a question that I hope that you'll ask yourself, and I hope that you'll wrestle with. Who had the biggest impact in this passage? I mean, sure, Jesus, had a ton of impact because he effectively blessed this bread and this fish to the point of where it multiplied and helped so many people, fed so many people, right? And you could say, of course, the disciples, just being in association with Jesus, they had huge impact. But the real superstar of this whole passage is the boy with the lunch. And at first, it kind of seems like the opposite. It seems like he doesn't have anything to offer. It seems like it wouldn't have made any difference. But what we see here and what you can take away from this is it wasn't the amount of what he had that allowed him to make a difference. It was the willingness to offer it that made the difference. It was a willingness to use what he had to attempt to help those around him, to attempt to influence the people around him. And his willingness impacted thousands of people. It impacted a huge crowd. And imagine that conversation with his mom when he got back home. Nobody would have imagined that or guessed that. Nobody saw that coming. That was quite literally out of left field. I don't know what field they were in, but that was out of left field. And it didn't matter that he didn't take a stage and give a huge speech. It didn't matter that he wasn't well known. It didn't matter whether or not he was in leadership. It didn't matter if he was a speaker or a preacher or somebody that people looked up to. It didn't matter if he was pop. It didn't matter if people knew who he was. It didn't even matter if we knew his name, obviously, because Scripture doesn't give us his name. But what did matter is that Jesus didn't care about any of that. What mattered was that the boy brought Jesus what he had to offer, and it was enough. Because he took what he actually had, what he was capable of using, and gave it to Jesus and allowed Jesus to use it. That's what mattered, because it was about the power that Jesus had and what he was capable of doing through someone who was willing to be used and offer what he had. And this is where we have to land with this knowledge, is that you have more of an effect than you think. I bet that little boy didn't walk into that field that day thinking, I'm going to feed 5,000 people. He didn't think that. Like, that's just not what was going through his mind. That wouldn't have been cognitively, like, relevant. It wouldn't have mattered to him at that point to feed these people. But when the opportunity came up, he was willing to give what he had. He was willing to give the little bit that he had, even if it wasn't much. And that's the lesson that we have to take, is that when we think of this as ourselves, and when we think of ourselves as not able to affect a situation, not having enough to make a big difference, then there are stories and opportunities that we miss out on as a result of that. There are things that we miss out on when we see ourselves as ineffective. And Jesus is showing this here in the story, that that's not true. So the way that we need to see influence has to change. And it's really just being willing to do something with what you have. That's when we cut it dry, it's not about doing more, it's not about knowing more, it's not about having more. But it's using what you have now and seeing that it has an effect. And imagining how God can use that. So there's these steps, 3 steps to consider, and this is where we're going to land. So if you want to take anything, take away these 3 steps to consider when you don't believe you have an effect. Think, who are the immediate people in front of you that need help, or that you could even help? Even if you don't see an immediate need, how could you help those people that are in front of you? And what is the thing that those people need? Do they need encouragement? Do they need time to talk something out? Do they need an open ear? Do they just need help, like physical help? And then identify with that what you can do to help, and then do it. And if we do those 3 steps, think about the possibility of positive effect that you could have on the people around you and the world around you, and what the world around you would be if you took what you just had, decided that it may not seem like enough, but it's what you have and you can't offer it, and then offer it to the people around you. I mean, ultimately, God is the one who has the power to change people. He's the one who has the power to help others. But the fact of the matter is, he wants to use you. He wants to use you. And all you have to do is to show up and offer what you have. Even if it is just 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. I hope that this message is helpful to you. I hope that it's a blessing. I hope that it is one of the next 3 that we have coming that will help you see how much of an awesome effect that you can have on the world around you. To look more like Jesus and to live more like Jesus and to help others the way that Jesus did. with what you have. I'll talk to y'all later, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.